The Hound of the Baskervilles, Chapter 14. One of Sherlock Holmes's defects, if indeed one can call it defect, was his extreme reluctance to communicate his plans to another person until the very moment of their execution. This arose, no doubt, partly from his own masterful nature, which loved to dominate and surprise those around him. Partly, too, it was due to his professional caution, which impelled him never to take a chance. Whatever the cause, the result was often trying for those who acted as his agents and assistants. I had often suffered from it, but never so much as during our long drive in the darkness. A great ordeal lay before us. We were at last close to our final effort, and yet Holmes said nothing, leaving me only to surmise what his course of action might be. My nerves throbbed with anticipation when at last a cold wind, blowing across our faces, and a dark, desolate expanse told me that we were upon the moor. Every stride of the horses and every turn of the wheels was bringing us closer to our ultimate adventure. Our conversation was hampered by the presence of the driver of our hired carriage, forcing us to speak of trivialities when our nerves were taut with excitement and suspense. I felt a sense of relief from this unnatural restraint when we passed Franklin's house, and I knew that we were nearing the hall and the scene of action. We did not drive up to the door, but stopped at the gate of the avenue. Having paid the driver and told him to return at once to Coombe Tracy, we set out on foot toward Merripit House. "Are you armed, Lestrade?" The little detective smiled. "As long as I have my trousers, I have a hip pocket, and as long as I have a hip pocket, there is something in it." "Good. My friend and I are also prepared for all emergencies. You seem to be deep in this case, Mr. Holmes. What is the game now?" "A game of waiting." "Upon my word, it's not a very cheerful place," said the detective, looking with a shudder at the gloomy slopes of the hills and the vast lake of fog which lay over the Grimpen Mire. "I see the lights of the house ahead of us. That is Merripit House, the end of our journey. I must ask you to walk on tiptoe and to speak in whispers." We moved cautiously along the track toward the house, but when we were about 200 yards from it, Holmes halted us. "These rocks on the right will provide an excellent screen," he said. "Are we to wait here?" "Yes, we shall make our ambush here. Step into this hollow, Lestrade. You've been inside the house. Watson, have you not? Can you tell me the position of the rooms? Where are those lattice windows at this end?" "I believe they're the kitchen windows. And that one there, which is so brightly lit, that is surely the dining room. The blind is up. You know the ground best. Creep quietly forward and see what they are doing. But, for heaven's sake, do not let them know that they are watched." I tiptoed down the path and stopped behind the low wall which surrounded the stunted orchard. Creeping along in the shadow of the wall, I reached a point from which I could look straight to the uncurtained window. There were only two men in the room, Sir Henry and Stapleton. They sat facing each other at a round table, their profiles turned toward me. Both were smoking cigars, and coffee and wine stood before them. Stapleton was talking with animation, but the baronet looked pale and distracted. Perhaps the thought of that lonely walk across the ill-omened moor was weighing heavily upon his mind. While I watched them, Stapleton rose and left the room, while Sir Henry filled his glass with wine and, leaning back in his chair, puffed at a cigar. I heard the creak of a door and the crisp sound of boots upon gravel. The steps passed along the path on the other side of the wall, under which I crouched. Looking over, I saw the naturalist stop at the door of an outhouse in the corner of the orchard. A key turned in a lock, and as he passed inside, there came from within a strange sound of scuffling. He was in the shed for no more than a minute. Then the key turned once more, and he passed me again and re-entered the house. I saw him rejoin his guest, and then I crept quietly back to my companions and told them what I had seen. "You say, Watson, that the lady was not there?" Holmes asked, when I had finished my report. "No. Where can she be, then, since no room but the kitchen is lighted?" "I cannot imagine." I noted that a thick white fog was hanging over the Grimpen Mire. It was moving slowly in our direction, appearing like a wall, low, but dense and clearly defined. The moon shone upon it, giving it the appearance of a great shimmering ice field, with the distant peaks rising above its surface like islands. "It is moving toward us, Watson. Is that serious?" "Very serious. The one thing that might touch my plans. But Sir Henry must not delay now. It is already 10 o'clock. Our success, and even his life, may depend upon his coming out before the fog covers the path." Above us, the night was clear and beautiful. The stars drifted bright and cold, while the full moon bathed the whole countryside in a soft, uncertain light. Before us stood the dark bulk of the house, its jagged roof and chimneys sharply outlined against the starlit sky. Broad bars of golden light from the lower windows stretched across the orchard and onto the moor. One of them was suddenly extinguished. The servants had left the kitchen. There remained only the dining-room window, where the two men, the murderous host and his unsuspecting guest, chatted on over their cigars. With every minute, the white plain that covered half the moor drifted closer and closer to the house. Already the first thin wisps of it were curling into the golden square of the lighted window. The farther wall of the orchard was already invisible, and the trees were rising out of a belt of white vapor. As we watched, the fog wreaths came crawling round both corners of the house and rolled slowly into a dense bank, until the upper floor and the roof floated like a fantastic ship upon a ghostly sea. Holmes struck his hand passionately against the rock and stamped his foot in his impatience. "If he isn't out in a quarter of an hour, the path will be covered. In half an hour, we shall not be able to see our own hands. Shall we move back to higher ground?" "Yes, I think it would be as well." So, as the fog bank flowed onward, we fell back before it until we were half a mile from the house, and still that dense white sea, with the silver moon curling upon its surface, swept slowly and inexorably surrounding us. "We are going too far," said Holmes. "We must not run the risk of him being overtaken before he can reach us. At all costs, we must hold our ground." He dropped on his knees and pressed his ear to the earth. "Thank God, I think he is coming." A sound of quick steps broke the silence of the moor. Crouching among the stones, we stared intently at the silver-tipped bank of vapor in front of us. The steps grew louder, and out of the fog, as through a curtain, stepped the man whom we awaited. He looked round him in surprise as he emerged into the clear, starlit night. Then he came swiftly along the path, passed close to where we lay in ambush, and began to mount the long slope behind us. As he walked, he glanced continually over either shoulder, like a man who is ill at ease. "Quiet," Holmes whispered, and I heard the sharp click of his cocked revolver. "Look, it is coming." From the heart of that slowly creeping bank of fog, there came a series of rhythmic, crunching thuds. The fog wall stood 50 yards away, and the three of us peered into it, not knowing what horror was about to emerge. I was at Holmes's very elbow and glanced at his face. It was pale and exultant, his eyes shining bright in the moonlight. But suddenly they started forward in a rigid, fixed stare. His mouth fell open in amazement. In that same instant, Lestrade gave a cry of terror and threw himself face downward upon the ground. I sprang to my feet, my hand heavy upon my weapon, my mind paralyzed by the dreadful shape which had leaped out upon us from the fog. It was a hound, an enormous coal-black hound, but such a hound as mortal eyes had never rested upon. Fire burst from its open mouth. Its eyes glowed with a smoldering glare, and its muzzle, hackles, and dewlap were outlined in flickering flame. Never in the delirious dream of a disordered brain could anything more savage, more appalling, or more hellish be conceived than that dark form and brute face which swept out upon us from the wall of mist. With long bounds, the huge black creature was racing down the track, following hard upon the heels of our friend. We were so paralyzed by its sudden appearance that it had passed us before we could recover our wits. Then Holmes and I fired together, and the creature's hideous howl told us that at least one of us had hit the mark. It did not stop, however, but bounded onward, far away along the path. We saw Sir Henry look back, his face white in the moonlight, his hands raised in horror, gazing helplessly at the frightful thing which was hunting him down. but that cry of pain from the hound had blown all our fears to the winds. If the beast was vulnerable, it was mortal, and if we could wound it, we could kill it. Never have I seen a man run as Holmes ran that night. I am reckoned fleet of foot, but he outpaced me as far as I outpaced the little detective. As we rushed along the path, we heard scream after scream from Sir Henry and the deep roar of the hound. I saw the creature leap upon his victim, hurl him to the ground, and fly at his throat. But at that very instant, Holmes emptied 5 barrels of his revolver into the creature's flank. With a last howl of agony and a vicious snap in the air, it rolled upon its back, its forepaws pawing frantically, and then fell limp upon its side. I stooped, panting, and pressed my pistol to the dreadful, glowing head, but there was no need to pull the trigger. The giant hound was dead. Sir Henry lay insensible. We tore away his collar, and Holmes breathed a prayer of gratitude when we found that there was no wound upon the throat, and that we had arrived in time. Already our friend's eyelids fluttered, and he made a feeble effort to move. Lestrade pushed his brandy flask between the baronet's teeth, and a pair of frightened eyes looked up at us. "My God," he whispered. "What was it? In heaven's name, what was it?" "Whatever it was, it is dead now," Holmes answered. "We have laid the family ghost forever." The creature which lay stretched before us was formidable from its very size and strength. It was not a pure bloodhound, and it was not a pure mastiff, but appeared to be a cross between the two, gaunt, savage, and as large as a small lioness. Even now, in the stillness of death, the huge jaws seemed to drip with a bluish flame, and the small, deep-set, cruel eyes were ringed with fire. I placed my hand upon the glowing muzzle, and as I held up my fingers, they too gleamed in the darkness. "Phosphorus," I said. "A cunning preparation of it," said Holmes, sniffing the dead animal. "There is no smell which might interfere with the hound's sense of scent. We owe you a deep apology, Sir Henry, for having exposed you to such a fright. I was prepared for a hound, but not for such a creature as this, and the fog gave us little time to receive him." "You have saved my life," said Sir Henry, "having first endangered it. Do you feel strong enough to stand? Give me another pull of that brandy, and I shall be ready for anything. So, now, if you will help me up, what do you intend to do?" "To leave you here. You are fit for no further adventure tonight. If you will wait, one of us will return to accompany you to the hall." Sir Henry tried to move, but he was still deathly pale, and every limb was shaking. We helped him to a rock, where he sat shivering, his face buried in his hands. "We must leave you now," said Holmes. "We have our work to finish, and every minute is precious. We have established the crime. It only remains to seize the criminal. 1,000 to 1 against finding him at the house now," Holmes continued, as we hurried back along the path. "The shots must have told him that the game was up. We were some distance away, and the fog may have muffled them. He would follow the hound to call it off. Of that you may be sure. No, he is gone by now. But we shall search the house to make certain." The front door was unlatched. We rushed inside and hurried from room to room, to the amazement of a doddering old manservant who met us in the passage. There was no light save in the dining room, but Holmes took the lamp and left no corner of the house unexplored. No sign could we find of the man we sought. On the upper floor, however, one bedroom door was locked. "There is someone in here," cried Lestrade. "I can hear a movement. Open this door." A faint moaning and rustling came from within. Holmes swung his foot against the door just above the lock, and it flew open. Revolvers in hand, we all three rushed into the room. But there was no sign of the desperate villain we expected to find. Instead, we were faced by an object so strange and so unexpected that we stood for a moment staring in amazement. The room had been fashioned into a small museum, its walls lined with glass-topped cases full of a collection of butterflies and moths to capture, of which had been the pastime of this complex and dangerous man. In the center of the room stood an upright beam, placed there to support the worm-eaten rafters. To this post a figure was tied, so swayed and bundled in sheets that one could not at first tell whether it was man or woman. One towel passed round the head and was secured to the pillar. Another covered the lower part of the face, and above it, two dark eyes, full of grief, shame, and a terrible questioning, stared out at us. In an instant, we had torn away the bonds, and Mrs. Stapleton sank upon the floor. As her beautiful head fell upon her chest, I saw a raw red wheal across her neck. "The brute!" cried Holmes. "Lestrade, your flask. Put her in the chair. She has fainted from ill usage and exhaustion." She opened her eyes again. "Is he safe?" she asked. "Has he escaped?" "He cannot escape us, madam." No, I do not mean my husband. Sir Henry? Is he safe?" "He is." "And the Hound?" "It is dead." She gave a long sigh of relief. "Thank God! Thank God! Oh, the villain! See what he has done to me." She turned up her sleeves, and we uttered a cry of horror to see that her arms were all mottled with bruises. "But that is nothing. It is my soul that he has tortured and defiled. I could endure it all, the ill usage, the solitude, the life of deception, everything, so long as I could still believe he loved me. But now I know that I was but his tool, and that he has deceived me." "You bear him no goodwill, then," said Holmes. "Tell us then where we shall find him. If you have ever aided him in evil, help us now to make atonement." "There is but one place where he can have fled," she answered. "There is an old tin mine on an island in the heart of the mire. It was there that he kept his hound, and there also he had made a refuge for himself. It is there that he has gone." The wall of fog pressed against the very window pane. Holmes held the lamp toward it. "Look," he said, "no one could find his way into the Grimpen Mire tonight." She laughed and clapped her hands. Her eyes and teeth gleamed with savage joy. "He might find his way in, but never out. How could he see the guidepost tonight? We marked the path together with little wands to trace a way through the mud. Oh! If only I could have pulled him up today. Then he would have been in your hands." It was clear to us that any pursuit would be in vain until the fog had lifted. We left Lestrade to guard the house, while we accompanied the baronet back to Baskerville Hall. It was no longer possible to hide the history of the Stapletons from him, but he bore the blow bravely when he learned the truth about the woman he loved. However, the night's adventures had shattered his nerves, and by morning he lay in a delirious fever, with Dr. Mortimer watching over him. The two of them were destined to travel the world together before Sir Henry would again become the hale, hearty man he had been before he became the master of that ill-fated estate. And now I come rapidly to the conclusion of the singular narrative, in which I have tried to make the reader share those dark fears and vague surmises which so long shadowed our lives and ended so tragically. By morning the fog had lifted, and Mrs. Stapleton led us to the place where the path through the mire began. When we saw the eagerness and joy with which the woman set us upon her husband's track, we realized how terrible her life must have been. We left her upon a thin peninsula of firm peat, which ran out into the morass. From its end, small wands planted here and there indicated where the path wound from one clump of reeds to another, between the green scum pits of the mire, impassable to any stranger. A smell of decay rose from the rotting reeds and slime, and a heavy miasmic vapor struck our faces, while more than once a false step sank us to our knees in the black, quivering bog, which rippled in soft waves for yards around our feet. As we walked, it seemed to clutch at our heels like pincers, and as we sank, it was as if an enemy's hand were pulling us down into those sinister depths. Only once did we find a sign that someone had passed this perilous way before us. Amid a patch of marsh grass, a dark object was visible. Holmes, stepping off the path to seize it, sank to his waist, and had we not been there to drag him out, he would never have set foot on firm ground again. He held an old black boot in his hand. Inside, Myers, Toronto, was printed upon the leather. "This find is worth a mud bath," said Holmes. "It is the missing boot of our friend Sir Henry, which Stapleton dropped here in his flight." "Exactly. It remained in his hand after he had used it to set the Hound upon Sir Henry's track. He fled when he saw the game was up, and at this spot he flung it away. We know, at least, that he reached this point in safety. But more than this we were never destined to know, though there was much we could surmise. There was no chance of finding footsteps upon the mire, for the rising slime smothered them instantly, and when we reached firm ground and searched for tracks, we found not the slightest sign. If the earth did not speak falsely, Stapleton never reached that island refuge toward which he had struggled to the fog on that last night. That cold and cruel man is buried in the heart of the Grimpen Mire, deep in the foul silt of the great morass. Many traces of him we found upon the island where he had hidden his savage ally. A huge driving wheel and a shaft half filled with rubble showed that a mine had once been worked there. Scattered around it were the ruins of miners' cottages, driven away, no doubt, by the foul vapors of surrounding bog. In one of them, a staple and chain, with a quantity of gnawed bones, showed where the hound had been kept. A skeleton with a tuft of brown hair adhering to it lay upon the floor. "A dog," said Holmes. "By heavens, it is a curly-haired spaniel. Poor Mortimer will never see his favorite again. Well, I do not think this place contains any secrets which we have not already solved. Stapleton could hide his hound, but he could not silence its voice, and that was the source of those cries which were so unpleasant to hear, even in the daytime. In an emergency, he could keep the hound in the shed at Merripit, but it was a risk, and only on the final day, when he thought his work was nearly done, did he venture to do so. The paste in this tin is surely the luminous mixture with which he smeared the animal. He was, of course, inspired by the family legend of a hellhound and the desire to frighten old Sir Charles to death. It is no wonder the poor convict ran and screamed, just as our friend did, and as we might have done ourselves, when he saw such a creature leaping through the darkness of the moor upon his track. It was a cunning device, for what peasant would dare to look closely at such a beast, seen dimly upon the moor? I said in London, Watson, and I say it again now, that never have we pursued a man more dangerous than he who lies out there. As he spoke, Holmes stretched his hand toward the vast expanse of the mire, mottled with green patches, where it blended on the horizon into the desolate moor. Chapter 15, a Retrospection. It was the end of November, and Holmes and I sat on a raw, foggy evening on either side of a blazing fire in our sitting room in Baker Street. My friend was in high spirits as a result of the successful conclusion of a series of difficult and important cases, and I was thus able to draw him into a conversation regarding the details of the Baskerville mystery. I had waited patiently for this opportunity, for I knew that Holmes would never permit the mixing of cases, and that his clear and logical mind would not be diverted from its present work by memories of the past. Sir Henry and Dr. Mortimer were in London, preparing for the long voyage which had been prescribed for the restoration of the baronet's shattered nerves. They had called upon us that very afternoon, so it was natural that the subject should come up for discussion. "The entire course of events," said Holmes, from the point of view of the man who called himself Stapleton, "was simple and direct, although to us, who lacked a motive at the start and saw only fragments of the facts, it appeared exceedingly complex. I have had 2 conversations with Mrs. Stapleton, and the case is now so entirely cleared up that I do not think there is any secret remaining. You will find a few notes upon the matter under the letter B in my index files. Would you mind giving me a sketch of the course of events?" "Certainly, though I cannot guarantee that I carry all the facts in my mind. Intense mental concentration has a curious way of blotting out what is past. However, as far as the Hound case is concerned, I will give you the sequence as accurately as I can, and you must remind me if I overlook anything. My inquiries have proved beyond all doubt that the family portrait did not lie, and that this fellow was indeed a Baskerville. He was the son of that Roger Baskerville, the younger brother of Sir Charles, who fled under a cloud to South America, where he was said to have died unmarried. In reality, he married and had one son, this fellow, whose real name is the same as his father's. This young man married Beryl Garcia, one of the beauties of Costa Rica, and, having embezzled a considerable sum of public money, he changed his name to Vandala and fled to England. There he established a school in the east of Yorkshire. His reason for choosing this particular profession was that he had met a consumptive tutor on the voyage and had used the man's expertise to make the venture a success. Fraser, the tutor, died, however, in the school, which had begun well, collapsed into a shameful reputation. Vandal found it convenient to change his name to Stapleton, and he brought the remains of his fortune, his plans for the future, and his love of entomology to the south of England. I learned at the British Museum that he was a recognized authority in science, and that the name Vandal had been given to a moth which he had first described during his stay in Yorkshire. We now come to that part of his life which has proved so interesting to us. This fellow had evidently made inquiries, and learned that only 2 lives stood between him and a valuable estate. I believe that when he went to Devonshire his plans were very hazy, but that he meant mischief from the start is evident from the fact that he took his wife with him in the character of his sister. The idea of using her as a decoy was clearly already formed in his mind, though he may not have been certain of the details. His goal was to obtain the estate, and he was prepared to use any weapon and run any risk to achieve it. His first act was to settle as near as possible to his ancestral home, and his second was to cultivate a friendship with Sir Charles Baskerville and the neighbors. The baronet himself told him the legend of the family hound, and in doing so he signed his own death warrant. Stapleton, as I shall continue to call him, knew that the old man had a weak heart and that a sudden shock might kill him. He had heard this from Dr. Mortimer. He also knew that Sir Charles was superstitious and took the grim legend seriously. His inventive mind at once conceived a way by which the baronet could be killed, and yet in such a way that it would be impossible to trace the death to a murderer. Having conceived this idea, he proceeded to carry out with extreme subtlety. An ordinary murderer would have been content with a savage hound. The effort to give it a diabolical appearance was a flash of genius on his part. He purchased a dog in London from Ross and Mangles on the Fulham Road. It was the strongest and most fearful beast they had. He brought it down by the North Devon line and walked at a great distance over moor so as to reach home unobserved. In the course of his entomological wanderings, he had already discovered a way into the Grimpen Mire, and thus he found a secure hiding place for the creature. There he chained it up and waited for his chance. But time passed, and the chance did not come. The old gentleman could not be lured outside his grounds at night. Several times Stapleton lay in ambush with his hound, but without result. It was during these fruitless quests that he, or rather his ally, was seen by the peasants, and the legend of the demon dog received new confirmation. He had hoped that his wife would entice Sir Charles into a trap, but here she proved unexpectedly independent. She would not consent to lure the old man into a sentimental attachment which would deliver him to his enemy. Neither threats nor, alas, blows could move her. She would have nothing to do with it, and for a time Stapleton was at a deadlock. He found a way out of his difficulties through the fact that Sir Charles, having taken a fancy to him, used him as an intermediary in his efforts to help the unfortunate Laura Lyons. By passing himself off as an unmarried man, Stapleton gained great influence over her, leading her to believe that if she could obtain a divorce from her husband, he would marry her. Suddenly, he realized his plans must be accelerated, for he learned that Sir Charles was about to leave the hall on the advice of Dr. Mortimer, advice with which he himself had feigned to agree. Not a moment was to be lost, or his victim might pass beyond his reach. He therefore pressured Mrs. Lyons into writing that letter, imploring the old man to give her an interview on the evening before his departure for London. Then, by a plausible pretext, he dissuaded her from keeping the appointment, and so obtained the opportunity for which he had waited. Returning from Coombe Tracey in the evening, he had just time to fetch his hound, smear it with his hellish concoction, and bring it to the gate where he knew the old man would be waiting. The dog, incited by its master, sprang over the wicket gate and pursued the wretched baronet, who fled screaming down the yew alley. In truth, it must have been a terrifying sight when, in that dark tunnel of greenery, the huge black beast with its flaming mouth and glowing eyes bounded after its victim. The old man fell dead at the end of the alley from heart failure and sheer terror. The hound had kept to the grassy border, while the baronet had run upon the path, and so only the human tracks were visible. Seeing him lie still, the creature had probably approached him and, finding him dead, had turned away. It was then that it left the prints which were observed by Dr. Mortimer. The Hound was called back and hurried away to its lair in the heart of the Grimpen Mire, leaving behind a mystery which baffled the authorities, terrified the locality, and finally brought the case within the scope of our observation. So much for the death of Sir Charles Baskerville. You perceive the devilish ingenuity of it, for it was really almost impossible to make a case against the true murderer. His only confederate was a creature which could not betray him, and the grotesque, inconceivable nature of the device only made it more effective. Both the women concerned, Mrs. Stapleton and Mrs. Laura Lyons, had strong suspicions against Stapleton. Mrs. Stapleton knew that he had designs upon the old man, and she knew of the existence of the Hound. Mrs. Lyons knew neither of these things, but she was struck by the fact of the death occurring at the very hour of an appointment which only Stapleton knew she had made. However, both were under his influence, and he had nothing to fear from them. The first half of his task was successfully accomplished, but the more difficult part remained. It is possible that Stapleton did not know of the existence of an heir in Canada. In any case, he very soon learned it from his friend Dr. Mortimer, who also gave him all the details of Sir Henry Baskerville's arrival. Stapleton's first thought was that this young Canadian might be disposed of in London, without ever coming down to Devonshire. He had mistrusted his wife since she had refused to help him lure the old man, and he dared not leave her for long out of sight, for fear of losing his influence over her. This was why he took her with him to London. I have learned that they stayed at the Mexborough Private Hotel in Craven Street, which was one of those searched by my agent. There he kept his wife a prisoner, while he himself, in a false beard, followed Dr. Mortimer to Baker Street, and afterwards to the station and to the Northumberland Hotel. His wife had some inkling of his plans, but she had such a fear of her husband, a fear founded upon brutal treatment, that she dared not write to Sir Henry and give him a direct warning. If the letter fell into Stapleton's hands, her own life would be in danger. Eventually, as we know, she adopted the device of cutting out printed words from a newspaper and pasting them together. For the address, she disguised her handwriting. The letter reached the baronet, and gave him his first warning of the danger which threatened him. It was of the utmost importance to Stapleton to obtain some article of Sir Henry's clothing, Holmes continued, so that, if it became necessary to use the Hound, he might always be able to set it upon his track. With his characteristic swiftness and audacity, he set about this at once, and we cannot doubt that the hotel chambermaid was liberally bribed to help him in his purpose. However, it happened that the first boot obtained for him was a new one, and therefore useless for his end. He returned it and obtained another. This was a most instructive incident, for it proved to me finally that we were dealing with a real Hound, as no other hypothesis could explain this persistent craving for an old boot rather than a new one. The more outre and grotesque an incident is, the more carefully it deserves to be examined, and the very circumstance which appears to complicate a case is the very one which, when properly and scientifically handled, is most likely to clarify it. The following morning, our friends were visited by us, and Stapleton continued to follow them in a hansom cab. From his knowledge of our rooms and my own appearance, as well as from his general conduct, I am inclined to conclude that Stapleton's criminal career is by no means limited to the Baskerville affair. It is significant that during the last 3 years, for considerable and daring burglaries have been committed in the West, and in none of these cases has the culprit been arrested. The last of them, at Folkestone Court in May, was remarkable for the cold-blooded murder of a policeman who surprised a masked, solitary thief. I cannot doubt that Stapleton found in this way the means of his subsistence, and that for many years he has been a desperate and dangerous man. We had a sample of his resourcefulness that morning when he escaped us so neatly, and of his audacity when he sent me a challenge by giving the driver my own name. From that moment, he realized that I had taken the matter up in London, and that there was no further chance for him there. He returned to Dartmoor and awaited the arrival of the baronet. "Wait," I said. "You have no doubt correctly traced a sequence of events, but there is one point which you have left unexplained. What became of the Hound while its master was in London?" "I have given that matter some thought, and it is certainly of some importance. There can be no doubt that Stapleton had a confederate, though it is unlikely that he ever gave himself away by sharing his full plans. There was an old manservant at Merripit House named Anthony. His connection with the Stapletons can be traced back several years to the time when they kept the school, so he must have known that his master and mistress were husband and wife. This man has disappeared. It is a suggestive fact that Anthony is an uncommon name in England, while Antonio is a very common one in all Spanish and Spanish-American countries. Like Mrs. Stapleton, the man spoke good English but with a curious accent. I myself saw this man crossing the Grimpen Mire by the path which Stapleton had marked out. It is very probable, therefore, that in his master's absence he took care of the Hound, though he may not have known for what purpose the beast was kept. The Stapletons then returned to Devonshire, followed soon after by yourself and Sir Henry. Now, a word as to my own proceedings at that time. You may remember that when I examined the paper upon which the printed words were fastened, I scrutinized the watermark very closely. In doing so, I held the paper within a few inches of my eyes, and I became conscious of a faint smell of white jasmine. There are 75 perfumes which it is very necessary that a criminal expert should be able to distinguish, and many a case, in my own experience, has more than once depended upon the prompt recognition of a scent. The smell of the perfume made me think of a lady's presence, and my thoughts already began to turn toward the Stapletons. Thus, I was convinced of the existence of the Hound, and had guessed the criminal before ever we went to the West. It was my business to watch Stapleton, Holmes said, but clearly I could not have done so had I been with you, for then he would have been on his guard. Therefore, I deceived everyone, yourself included, and came to Devonshire while all thought I was in London. I did not suffer as much as you imagined, though such trifling details must never count in a criminal investigation. Most of the time I lived in Coombe Tracy, and only used a hut upon the moor when it was necessary to be near the scene of action. Cartwright came with me, and, disguised as a country lad, was of great use. It was his duty to look after my food and clean linen. While I watched Stapleton, Cartwright often watched you, so that I knew everything at once. I have already told you that your reports reached me very rapidly, as they were forwarded immediately from Baker Street to Coombe Tracy. They were of great use to me, especially that accidentally accurate fragment of Stapleton's biography. I was able to establish the identity of both husband and wife, and knew exactly where I stood. The case was much complicated by the incident of the escaped convict and his relationship to the Barrymores. You cleared that up beautifully, though I had already reached the same conclusion through my own observations. By the time you found me on the moor, I was fully acquainted with all the circumstances, but I did not yet have a case which I could take before a jury. Even Stapleton's attempt on Sir Henry's life on the night the convict died did little to help us prove a premeditated murder against our client. There was no other way but to catch the murderer red-handed, and for that, we had to use Sir Henry as a decoy, alone and to all appearances defenseless. We did so, and at the cost of a severe shock to our client, we succeeded in finishing the case and bringing Stapleton to his ruin. I must confess that it is a reproach to my management of the case that I exposed Sir Henry to such an ordeal, but we had no means of foreseeing the terrifying spectacle which the Hound presented, nor could we predict the fog which allowed it to burst upon us so suddenly. We achieved our end at a price which both doctors, the specialist and Dr. Mortimer, consider to be merely temporary. A long voyage will allow our friend not only to strengthen his shattered nerves, but also to heal his heart. His love for Mrs. Stapleton was deep and sincere, and for him, the saddest part of this dark business is the fact that he was deceived by her. It only remains for me to indicate the part she played in all this. There can be no doubt that Stapleton had an influence over her which can be explained either by love or fear, or perhaps by both, as the two are quite compatible. In any case, his influence was very real. At his command, she consented to pass as a sister, though a limit was placed upon his power over her when he attempted to make her a direct accomplice in murder. She was ready to warn Sir Henry as far as she could without betraying her husband, and she tried to do so more than once. Stapleton himself seemed capable of jealousy, and when he saw the baronet paying court to his wife, even though it was part of his own plan, he could not help interrupting with a passionate outburst that revealed the fiery soul he so skillfully hid beneath his self-control. By encouraging the friendship, Stapleton was sure that Sir Henry would often come to Merripit House and that sooner or later he would find the opportunity he desired. But when the critical moment came, his wife suddenly turned against him. She had heard something of the convict's death and knew that the Hound was to be locked in the outhouse on the evening Sir Henry was to come to dinner. She charged her husband with the intended murder, and there followed a wild scene in which he told her for the first time that she had a rival in his love. Her loyalty turned at once to burning hatred, and he saw that she would certainly betray him. He therefore tied her up to prevent her from warning Sir Henry, hoping, no doubt, that when the whole countryside attributed the baronet's death to the family curse, as was bound to happen, he would again win her over, forcing her to accept the accomplished fact and keep silence. In this, I think, he miscalculated. A woman with Spanish blood in her veins does not easily forgive such an insult. And now, my dear Watson, without referring to my notes, I cannot give you a more detailed account of this curious case. I think that nothing of importance remains unexplained. He could not hope to frighten Sir Henry to death with his ghost hound, as he had done with the old uncle. I asked. The beast was savage and hungry. Even if its appearance had not frightened the victim to death, it would at least have disabled him and left him helpless to resist. No doubt. There remains one more question. If Stapleton had succeeded in obtaining the inheritance, how would he have explained the fact that he, the heir, had lived so near the estate under a false name? How could he have claimed the property without exciting suspicion and inquiry? He would have been in a formidable difficulty, and I fear you ask too much of me if you expect me to solve it. The past and the present are within the scope of my inquiries, but what a man may do in the future is a hard question to answer. Mrs. Stapleton says that her husband had more than once discussed the dilemma. There were 3 ways out of it. He could, after establishing his identity in South America, claim the fortune from there without ever coming to England, or he could have adopted an elaborate disguise for the short time he needed to be in London, or, finally, he could have found an accomplice to whom he would have handed over the proofs of identity and papers, passing him off as the heir and claiming a share of the income. From what we know of him, we cannot doubt that he would have found a way out of the difficulty by one means or another. And now, my dear Watson, we have had some weeks of severe work, and I think that for one evening we may turn our thoughts to more pleasant subjects. I have a box for Les Huguenots. Have you heard the Duresques? May I ask you to be ready in half an hour, and we can stop for dinner at Marcini's on our way to the opera?